Oh, okay.
And the green light is on, so let's start this thing.
Cool.
So, welcome to the inaugural NYC HTML5 broadcast. You can find out more about us if you add a .com to that NYC HTML5, and we have an IRC channel as well. So I am Sepi, and I'm here with my fellow organizer, Trevor Landau.
Yo.
Hey, Trev. We also, our other organizer, JP, is out, but maybe he'll pop back in later on. And we're joined by our speakers from last month's event. So we have Shefali. Say hi.
Hi.
There you go. And Alex.
Hello.
And Amjad.
Hey.
So I think all of us are in New York except Amjad, who is out in Jordan, which is awesome. So to get things started, why don't we go around the table and tell us where you do your thing and what you do there, and maybe a little bit about your presentation, and that'll kind of get us rolling. And we'll start with Shefali.
Sure. So, hi, I'm Shefali. I work at A&E Networks right now. So I work on the websites like History and FYI. I used to work at Condé Nast for the longest time. Was with the New Yorker working on their site. Basically, it was the site link for the site. And then briefly, I worked for HBO in between. I mostly am a front-end developer, so I do JavaScript, CSS, and that's kind of the motivation that got me thinking, because I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, and in doing like different sites, from like websites to sites or websites, web applications made for device like the iPad, I realized that some things change when you start thinking about different devices, and then things are also changing as far as performance is concerned because of how we're going towards responsive and how we're supporting different devices. So that kind of got me thinking about this presentation on CSS front-end performance.
Okay. Great. So what about you, Alex?
So I'm a developer here at Behance. I happen to work with Sepi now. We're really just running one website for Adobe at this point, Behance.net. But I have built great portions of that site along with everybody else here. The team really we split up so that the front end work is split out between the CSS people and the JavaScript people, and me and Sepi are on the JavaScript team. And really, the talk that I gave was just to share some of the lessons we learned and the insights we gained as we're trying to build Behance.net, especially one that is not just mobile friendly but also like truly responsive. So that's how I get there.
Cool. What about you, Amjad?
Yeah, so I work on the JavaScript infrastructure team at Facebook. Currently based in New York, but right now I'm in Jordan, like Joe mentioned, on vacation. We'll be back to New York next week. Before transitioning in to the JavaScript infrastructure team, I worked on the photos team, and a lot of what I've done, like I spent most of my time fixing bugs and fixing the album uploader flow at Facebook. And I learned a great deal about debugging JavaScript just because a lot of our issues were in the JavaScript stack. And I took all my learnings and built a few tools around them, and then presented them at the last meetup. It was great.
Cool, cool. Yeah, and I look forward to digging into those tools a little bit more with you later in the broadcast. But let's go around. I guess let's start by asking maybe what it was that got you thinking about the topic that you presented on. So, like Shefali, what got you thinking about CSS performance in particular? Was there a certain project you were working on, or was it just a more general, curiosity?
It was both, but mostly, a project that I got pulled into. So last year when I left the New Yorker, HBO was redesigning their HBO.com experience for the iPad, and it was an Angular app that was almost near finished. But what was stopping it from being released is that the performance wasn't quite there according to the product people. It was loading a little too slow, and it was the paints were taking too long because it was basically a parallax website. So a team of us in the end kind of came in and speeded up the performance. So I've learned a few things there, like the SVG, the use of SVG for icons. That just made it easier. Like everything looked nicer with SVGs. The same with data URIs. We researched and we implemented these things, and they seem to make a difference, along with other other steps that the JavaScript Angular team took. So that was kind of what got me ready for this presentation. And it seems like now that more and more websites are going to be on mobile devices, it just becomes a bigger issue. Because like we crossed the first reason we needed high-performance websites earlier was because the internet was slow, so you needed websites to load faster. Now it's mobile devices are the bottleneck, and to make sure that the experience there is not shitty, not crappy, not frustrating, you want to not have any part of your web page be the bottleneck. So I chose to kind of focus on CSS and the assets that CSS uses.
Cool. What about you, Alex? What drove you down your responsive path?
Well, I was kind of thrown down this path by demands of essentially the design for our website having changed. So Behance underwent several large-scale redesigns and rebuilds over the course of the past 3 years or so. And one of those is to change, the project originally started as just to change the Behance front page. So the very first page that you hit when you go to Behance. And the demand for that page to be visible across devices was not only because we did not have a mobile app available at that point, but also that we just wanted it to be seen in as wide a capacity as possible by anybody with any kind of a web browser. So that's really what drove us to start creating things that are capable of responding to size changes, orientation changes, all manners of things. Because what design wanted in the end is for an experience that's going to feel natural no matter how you're trying to interact with it. Mm-hmm. And so that's essentially what our final aim was. Oh, I just see Sepi walking past me here.
So I think he's getting situated from away from some sound. But hopefully we didn't lose him entirely here. I guess filling in for him in this moment, you can continue on with the same question. Amjad?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, when I started at Facebook, I started on the photos team, and one thing that was a pressing issue was the album upload reliability on the desktop site, and it wasn't like it was mostly not a server-side issue. When a lot of people think about reliability, they think about the 4 nines of reliability, and they think about servers and networks and CDNs and data centers and all that stuff, which is really interesting and hard also. But a lot of people don't think about the problems you have on the front end, and especially when you're shipping JavaScript to a billion people, you tend to like hit really edge cases, and every edge case could be like a million people, and so we started fixing bugs in JavaScript, and I learned a great deal. And when you're dealing with Facebook scale code base, and you have hundreds of modules being loaded asynchronously, and you have a lot of code just running, sometimes you have things changing, like state changing from under your feet, or you have different objects being loaded, or different methods being called. So I built a few tools and built an understanding around debugging in JavaScript, especially at that scale. And yeah, that's how I came to sort of write and talk about this stuff.
So since you mentioned the tools, will you share with us the couple of tools that you've written?
Sure. The first one was Debug Utils, and the idea behind Debug Utils is, as the complexity of your code increases and you have many different modules talking to each other, sometimes you need a way to sort of set up traps in order to break at a point that you define and sort of inspect the state of your code and see what's happening. So, of course, you can do breakpoints, but a lot of the times you want to sort of do that from the command line while in the live environment. As an example, let's say you have a link on the page, and you click that link, and that link is not redirecting the website. So something must be wrong, and the first thing that comes to mind is prevent default. Someone is calling prevent default. Mm-hmm. And so you can go and grep through your code, but that's going to take a long time. So the easiest thing to do is to just override the prevent default method on the event prototype and insert a debugger statement. And next time you click the link, the offending code, the code that disabled or prevented default, will be right up the call stack once you break, right? So this utility just makes things like that easy, and it just like one line of code or even like a few characters to type, and you can just set up what I call traps.
Okay, and is that a plugin or is it a library drop in your code or?
Yeah, you can either drop it into your code. I also packaged it up as a Chrome DevTools command line. So whenever you open your console, you'll have the functions loaded up there.
Cool.
And it also works with objects. A lot of the times, what happens is you have an object and everything's fine, and you look at the object, and it's exactly what you expect, and then something happens, and the state changes. The properties are different. So what you can do is you can set up those traps on setters and getters. So the next time something tries to set your object, it will break, and it will show you the code that is trying to mutate your object. So
cool.
And other goodies like that. Yeah.
That's awesome. You guys have any questions? All right, cool.
Yeah, cool. There was the other tool really quickly that I wanted to mention was FB Flow, and it's not primarily a debugging library, but what it allows you to do is you can a lot of people call it live editing or live coding, whatever you want to call it, but basically just writing code and automatically swapping that code in the browser without refreshing. So I wrote that tool because I was sick of just every time I changed something just for debugging purposes or added a console log or something that I had to refresh. So I wrote it to be flexible enough to make it work with remote file systems, to work with any editor that you want, and just integrate with any like development environment you have. So it helps you iterate really fast and on your code and just try to fix bugs as fast as possible.
Alex, I wanted to ask you about the media query stuff. What did you try anything else? Did you do? I imagine you did some research before you went down that path. What were you finding when you were looking for media query kind of tools and support?
Well, media queries themselves were not the big problem. But there are media query backfill libraries, which are great, and I love them. But the problem that we were having is not just being able to do it. but being able to do it across all of the things that we had and do it in a sane manner. So the problem was not that we wanted to, but could not find when the screen changed size. It was that when you have the screen changing size, I don't want anybody else to know about it. I want as little thought about it as possible. And for these things to be just much more declarative and magical, so that the programmer can come in and say that it is more logical for them to say that for this breakpoint, for this particular set of assumptions that I'm going to make about your screen size, I want the view to be responding to you in this way. So for that problem, I did not find anything else out there, but then again, we did this 2 years ago, so that was still quite new back then.
You got anything, Trevor? I saw you lean in there. So what are your thoughts about, like, I'm wondering what is coming in the future that might change these sort of approaches? Like, are there any things coming up in the languages or the specs that might make it easier to manage this sort of responsive view layer?
Not for responsive views themselves. The changes upcoming in the language are great. I love ES6, which is why we have the transpiler here. But I don't think anything is, because what we're trying to abstract is not something at such a low level that it avails all the people out there, all the developers out there. It's really just for situations where you need to have a lot of responsive things, and for the responsive things to not appear as if they're responsive to the rest of the code base. So the rest of the code base should treat these things as if they were just normal objects, and inside it is where the internalization and the actual application of these techniques take place. And the application of these techniques don't even necessarily have to take place at a visible layer. It should be as invisible and as little thought to how you're going to do it, and more thought about what it is that you want to do. I'm not sure that there's anything upcoming that helps alleviate that, but I would try anything at this point to maintain less code.
Yeah. So then, like Match Media, you don't think really provides any benefit or future benefit?
I mean, Match Media is the application of media queries in JavaScript, so that is what it's based off of.
Okay. And what? Go ahead, Trevor.
Also, I was just going to. Were you going to stay on the same topic? Because I'm just going to ask you a different question.
Sure, go ahead.
So I really like how. Well, I know you guys use Backbone for your views and assuming modeling, whatnot. I was looking at the API for NBD, and it certainly is influenced by that, and I think it's great because Backbone really kind of stays natural to JavaScript, which is I'm a big fan of that in terms, or rather, in comparison to Ember and Angular, which kind of have their own styles of programming, in my opinion. And I'm not personally not a big fan of them because they don't stick to the natural side of JavaScript. So I was curious, have you tried using this with any of the other libraries other than Backbone? And does it work well? Or you know?
I have actually never tried this with anything outside of because NBD itself offers views, and we abstract on top of that. So we have essentially our own stack at this point. The NBD as a library originally started out as being very Backbone-ish because a series of missteps were made and we did not actually use Backbone, but a lot of the ideas are influenced from Backbone, and I do love a lot of Backbone's philosophy about, like what you said, sticking to what JavaScript offers rather than trying to recreate more of the world. I have not tried it with any other views, and I am not actually sure how well that's going to go. But the base idea behind it should be translatable across across different libraries, because MBD's utility modules really don't care that much. I mean, the library itself is called MBD, so it's not supposed to be a big deal. The media module itself doesn't really, I mean, it doesn't really care. It's just more sugar on top of the existing Match Media API. And it's in mixing together the sugar on that side with the sugar on the MVC side that we're able to state things in a declarative manner. So you can duplicate the same thing with Angular and with Ember as well, but you're just gonna have to create more subclasses that are going to do that thing. Whereas for us, because we have our own library, we can just kind of bake it in so that it becomes easier for us to deal with in the end.
Cool.
Yeah, so to be clear, we're not using Backbone, but we have MBD as like a base layer that's providing like kind of core functionality, and then on top of that we have a more opinionated Backbone-like, I guess, framework called BFF. Right, Alex?
Yes. I don't know if I said anything about BFF at the talk, but yeah, at Behance we have another layer on top of MBD because the complaint was that MBD was not sugary enough. So we then created BFF, Behance Frontend Framework, also your best friend forever, just to help with all the things that the average developer here would find themselves doing a lot and make it really easy for them to do. So.
Cool. So I'm going to switch gears and turn it over to Shefali. I wanted to ask her like what she sees in the future, things coming up that might help with the sort of performance that she was trying to tackle.
Yeah, I think like I mentioned before, a big thing is going to be the fact that more people are just going to use, devices with less processing power and over networks that are not super reliable. So you basically have to think in a way that it's not like a big fat desktop with a lot of processing power that's going to render your site. So I think you kind of have to stick to the basics of performance, make fewer requests, keep your asset size smaller, and use things like progressive Jpegs if you can, to at least give the illusion to the user that they get content at the soonest possible, and then add, image quality and focus. I think you mentioned in your talk that preprocessors might be hurting performance, and I think that's an interesting idea too. So CSS preprocessors basically are like CoffeeScript, right? For JavaScript, where you write some Sass, and then that preprocessor renders out a whole bunch of CSS. And that CSS, more often than not, tends to be a little bloated, a little bigger than the CSS that you would write by hand. Mm-hmm. And I think this, if you stick to like some sensible coding practices, you can kind of keep that bloat low. But as far as performance is concerned, the major bloats are not in the size of the CSS file itself, but more in the assets that they use, primarily images. They're more with the page actually rendering. So if you're using like heavy CSS styles, that's probably a killer. If you're using big fat JPEGs and you're not putting them in data URIs and making a request to the image through CSS, that's a bigger problem than the CSS file size itself. So I feel like with CSS preprocessors, if you're writing them, if you're using like object-oriented CSS, and if you're writing them right, you can kind of keep the CSS file size to a point where it doesn't affect your performance that much. But focusing more on assets that the CSS uses and kind of minimizing requests is the way to go. I would be interested to. I haven't looked at the work that Alex has done with responsive. I think it'd be an interesting idea. to kind of see if that could somehow be used for improving performance. But I think the big thing is just figuring out how to make websites that work across devices without having them slow down on devices that might not be as powerful and networks that might not be as strong.
So we actually just jump in here. We actually do a little bit of that at Behance. So when you go to the front page of it, we are dynamically loading in CSS based on what breakpoint you're in, and if you switch breakpoints, it will load more CSS in.
I see. Yeah. That's true. So conditional loading CSS using Modernizer, I'm not sure. What do you guys use to conditionally load CSS?
We're actually using MVD's media module to do it.
Okay. Yeah, I think.
Sorry. So what about JavaScript? Do you also, Alex? Do you also conditionally load JavaScript? Because I know you implement a lot of the responsive code in JavaScript.
Yeah, we conditionally load some of our JavaScript, but not a great deal of it, because after doing some testing, we found out that by building all the things into module packs, like just giant packs of modules, we actually don't gain that much by conditionally loading less or more JavaScript in. So the part where we do conditionally load JavaScript, it loads a significant chunk of JavaScript in. So don't do it for small things. If you're going to commit to that kind of approach, go all the way. Like if you're pulling a full feature into a page.
That makes sense. So Shefali, I'm curious. This is kind of interesting, and I've been hearing more and more talk about this sort of stuff. But it seems like some of the things that we have been doing for a while, or have been moving in that direction, are now going backwards. So, for example, putting CSS in the head, and sprite images might be bad once we get more with HTTP, and it seems like in some ways things are moving a little bit backwards, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think that's also true for progressive JPEGs, which is what used to be the way you'd load images on browsers way back when. Like you had an option to kind of do that in the 90s because internet speeds were super slow, and we're going back to it because you just, with progressive JPEGs, you basically want the user to see that there's content there, and in responsive design, you kind of want the image to take the place that it's going to take on the first load, so that the content doesn't flow around it when the whole image loads. So yeah, it's weird. I think that's why performance is super interesting, because these things keep changing depending on where you're loading the site. And SVGs, for instance, are also something that's not new. I think I mentioned that before. It's basically, instead of having an image, you draw the vectors for that image on the browser. And they've been around forever. They've been around since the 90s again. But they're coming back because we realized that if you have big images, you load the SVG and then you transform it if you have to using JavaScript. And yeah, it's so you kind of keep doing the things that were always good, like minifying and concatenating and all that, but you also start using all these old school tricks in combination. I think in the last meetup there was a presentation on Svg Sprites, and I think that's super interesting, where you have like a sprite of all your logos on the website, but it's an SVG instead of like a PNG or a JPEG. And then to combine that with the data URI, so you have the SVG sprite loading in the CSS through a data URI is, I think that can work in a lot of cases where like you have a strip of logos. Of course, it doesn't work in all cases, but I think that's where the judgment of the developer comes in, where like where is that limit where the sprite becomes too big to load within the page instead of like breaking it down into smaller sprites and all that.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, with like HTTP 2.0 coming out, we supposedly it's like a worse practice to actually combine your files together because of how the pipelining works for that.
Right.
So we'll be changing our practices again
Right.
soon.
A new presentation again. Like a year.
So I've been seeing more SVG animations in web applications. Do you have any comments on like performance of those?
Yeah. So SVG animations work great if you have a big screen where you're drawing things and where like things are changing like in some part of the image. So what SVG is that it's like HTML, right? It's got a markup, it's got a DOM. So it works great if you want to like load the whole thing. It's got great quality. It works. It scales really well on like devices with high pixels. And then if you want to like change some of that SVG, that's pretty great because you're not going to redraw the whole image, so it takes less time. Compare this with something like Canvas, where it relies completely on JavaScript. SVGs too, if you want to change them through animation, but otherwise they don't. So Canvas A relies on JavaScript. B, you have to kind of know the Canvas API, and Canvas I think works great if you want to like draw a lot of things, because that it does really well. But if you want to make a small change, it still redraws the whole canvas, which kind of, in my mind, is a performance killer. But it works great for things like video games. Maybe not so much like a big site or a big image on a site which you want to change just a little bit based on some user interaction.
Cool. So, Amjad, I wanted to ask you, I haven't done very much like Chrome plugin or extension development work. I was curious what your experience was like with that.
I have a sort of a hate-love relationship with that. I love it so much because it's the few times that you as a web developer is working with a predictable environment, because you're shipping code to Chrome, and Chrome is always up to date. It implements the JavaScript spec really well. It has all these nice APIs. It has all these non-standard nice APIs, and this is the part I hate, or I hate to love, I should say, because it's obviously not great for the web that we have Chrome going off and doing all these really awesome things and giving us great tools, but at the same time, it's not really the open web that we are working on. Now back to the subject without going too far off into this direction. It's like I said, it's a really nice environment. You get to use the nice tools. The Chrome extension API is pretty cool too. You get to hook into the development environment and tools that you work with day to day and extend them. And once I knew that I can extend that, I sort of like started going crazy with that. So Debug Utils and FBflow both hooks into the DevTools API, and it's great.
Cool.
I also have another extension called eHistory. It's one of my first JavaScript applications that I wrote. It basically adds Google-style filters to your history search, so you can like filter by URL, filter by date. For example, if you remember that one time you read this article in the New York Times about coffee, let's say, so you can say something like NURL NewYorkTimes.com and then entitle coffee, and then you'll get that from your history page. So yeah, I really like it, but I'm really passionate about the open web, and I like to build things for all browsers and not just Chrome.
The Gaza event, I was wondering how your hacking that went.
Yeah. So it went fine. We had about 10 people show up, and we started hacking on stuff for the thing that we started collaborating on at first was an application where you can send an SMS to one of the numbers. Hopefully, like we went to use Twilio, but it was hard to use that. uh, we wanted to also collaborate with the phone companies there. You send a text, and then you can broadcast sort of that you need help with something. But that plan did not go as expected because while hacking on it, we started getting in touch with people over there, and they said, no, you shouldn't do that because we're losing cell connection, and we also do not have electricity. They only had electricity for a couple of hours every 2 days. So it was really hard to do anything that involved technology. So we started doing things just to raise awareness about the situation and maybe raise some money. We have a few projects going on, but I think what came out of that hackathon was just a kickoff event because a lot of other people started doing that. I think there was an event in Berlin and there was an event in Algeria as well, and they actually shipped some code and are doing stuff. I don't think there's anything major that I can talk about that is actually helping people over there. I would hope something in the next couple of weeks we'll have something out, but overall it was fine.
Cool. Yeah, I find it fascinating to see how technology be involved in this kind of world of politics. So let's
just one follow up on that. What inspired me to do that was actually when Hurricane Sandy happened in 2000. It was my first year in the U.S. and in New York, and what I've seen, the tech industry and programmers do. There was a lot of applications, like first responders applications. People used Twitter in really nice ways. I think there was also an application where you can share your stuff and your home and invite people who lost their electricity and who lost their homes to come crash at your place. And there was a lot of collaboration. People built really nice tools to help each other. And it was the first time that I thought that we can build software to actually help people in crisis, and that was an eye opener.
I muted you, Amjad. Sorry about that. I was just going to say, let's go around the table and maybe each of you can give what the takeaway from your talk is, just a couple of bullet points, and we'll kind of wrap things up.
Yeah, sure. I think there's a lot of tools at our disposal. In my talk, I sort of start with the history of JavaScript tools and debugging and stuff like that, and I kind of show the early IE debugging where you have that small yellow rectangle on the bottom of the page is showing that you have an error on the page, and what we have now, which is the state-of-the-art dev tools that we have from Firefox and Chrome and Safari. And I think we're still stuck in old ways of debugging, just printf debugging or console log debugging, and there's a lot to do. And I think I took that to heart just this year, and I hope a lot of people will start doing that and really learning the tools that we have.
Yeah, it's funny. Every time I console log something, I think to myself, there's probably a better way to do this. But anyway, moving on. Alex, what are your couple of takeaways?
Yeah, Giuseppe, there's a better way to do it. I wrote it. It's called Logger, NB Logger. Use it. The takeaway for me is really just you have to do a certain amount in order for the APIs to. It's not even sugar. It's just for the APIs to start making sense to you, right? So the native HTML5 APIs, they're great in that they provide capability, but they're not great in that they don't provide capability in a consistent manner. So the developers are really, you really have to sit down and read the spec sometimes in order to find out what you're supposed to do in order to use certain things, and that's really difficult and not something that a lot of developers enjoy doing. So I think what it's really the overarching lesson is that use the HTML5 APIs, but use it not raw. Do it in a way that starts making the problem make sense to you. Because in the end, it's not just about being able to use new features, it's about solving certain problems with those features. So always think about what the problem is first, and then think about what the features are provided to you by the platform are.
That makes sense. Very good. Shefali, you got a couple of closing points?
Sure. I think Alex made a good point where a set of guidelines or APIs might or might not work for you. It kind of stands true for performance too. So yes, maybe SVGs work great for some people and they might not work in your app. So I think my big takeaway was, when I was thinking about this presentation, was that you kind of have to be mindful of what your website or your app is trying to do, what devices it's going to play on, and then you start basically your research. There will be some good practices, but then you have to see if they apply to you. And as far as performance is concerned, because things are changing and specs change and devices change, that changes. So you kind of have to keep up a lot every time you do a new redesign or write code from scratch or try improving performance of existing code. So I don't know, just read a lot and use the network tab, timeline to kind of test out your ideas and theories. Even if they don't match what's out there, if it's working for your app, go ahead and use it unless someone complains.
And write a blog post and share it with everyone.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
Or go to NYC HTML5 meetup and make a big fat presentation about it.
Even better choice.
Yes. And I think that's good advice too in general, especially in the front-end world. We just always trying to stay on top of things and stay current and using best practices and technologies.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, I think that concludes our broadcast. In post-production, we'll have some flags waving and the national anthem going. But I want to thank Trevor, my fellow organizer, and shout out to JP who could make the broadcast. I hope his fire is put out. Thanks to our guests, and as I mentioned, you can find out more about NYC HTML5 at .com and find us on IRC. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
By the way, our next event is September 10th. Sign up now.
Perfect.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. Cheers.
See ya.
Thanks, guys.
See ya.